Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today. We are continuing with the virtual reading group to read the um, hot off the presses book, Crises of the Republic, which seems like it could be taken out of today's headlines. Um, and this is a book that Arendt published in 72. This particular article, the second piece in it, Civil Disobedience, was published in 1970 in The New Yorker. Um, it appeared, obviously, during the height of the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. Um, and it was, as Arendt tells you in the very beginning, a response to, in a sense, a contest or a query made by Eugene Victor Debs Rostow. Uh, love that name. Who was the dean of the Yale Law School, a well-known Cold Warrior and State Department official. Um, and amidst the crises of the Republic, which at that time included the Vietnam War, the protests, the campus unrest, executive war powers, attacks on universities like Kent State. I mean, again, everything we're talking about in 1970 seems quite relevant today. Um, and the rising skepticism about courts as neutral guardians as well. Um, and so Eugene Rostow, who was the dean of the Yale Law School, and also worked for the New York City Bar Association, asked people to write about the question of, is the law dead? Are we seeing the loss of authority? Is this the end of the republic? These were the kind of questions that people were thinking about. And amidst the description of what he wanted people to write about, he included one idea, which is, what is the citizen's moral relation to the law in a society of consent? Right? Do citizens in a democracy, in a society of consent, have an obligation to obey the law? If the law, if the legally enacted authorities, the president and the Congress, pass a law that empowers um, a quasi legal military force like the Immigration and Customs Enforcement group to wear masks and run around cities and arrest people, right? I mean, we have to understand that these are legally empowered organizations by legally elected people. Um, what is the citizen's moral relation to the law in a society of consent? And that's the question Arendt takes up. I don't think there are many more timely and relevant questions that we could be thinking or talking about today. Um, Arendt begins by sort of saying that there's an oddity in the U.S. in the United States, and it's in the United States form of government, which relates to this question because the United States has different legal regimes, right? It's a federalist system. And as a federalist system, you have the state legal regime, you have the federal legal regime, and then you have both state constitutions and federal constitutions. And what this means, Arendt says, is that um, when you talk about the citizen's moral relation to the law, there can be different laws, right? What's your moral relation to the state law? What's your moral relation to the federal law? How does that relate to the Constitution? And she says that what's unique about the United States, and look, there are other federalist systems in the world, but none, she thinks, that are as um, vibrantly uh, vibrantly created, in which you have so many different legal regimes that claim your obedience and authority. She says that what this means is that in the United States, you can break one law, like a state law, in the name of a federal law, or you can break a federal law in the name of a state law, or you can break a federal law in the name of a constitutional idea. And so she says what this means is that there's this odd way in which civil disobedience is uniquely American. Uh, it has a kind of, and she thinks that it really does, even though it has a long history, she thinks that its modern instantiation is deeply tied to an American constitutional system. We'll get to that next week when we talk about the last part of this essay. Um, one of the one of the interesting aspects of this idea that civil disobedience is not about breaking one law in the name of conscience, but is actually about breaking a law in the name of another law, right? A law like the federal law or the state law or the Constitution, is that she says this means that the typical understanding of civil disobedience, which is that we break a law to test the law, um, uh, is not right. Um, what she says is that jurists, lawyers, make this case. They say that you justify civil disobedience on moral and legal grounds. They say that civil disobedience can be conscientious objection to a law, or it can be a legal attempt to test the constitutionality of a statute. But she says the civil disobedience, that's really a misunderstanding, she thinks. And this is central to her reading. She thinks that civil disobedience and a civil disobedient, the actor of a civil disobedience, is neither a legal nor a moral actor. And this is going to be I think controversial but interesting and important, right? Um the civil disobedient, she says, can only act and function and survive as a member of a group, not as an individual actor. Um The single civil disobedient is eccentric. He's someone who, stands in the middle of the road and says, the space aliens are coming. And, he blocks traffic. But she says, we don't take him very seriously. He's an eccentric. Civil disobedience, she says, only really works and only really functions when it's carried out by numbers of people who have a community of opinion and interest. She holds out in this regard the freedom riders of the civil rights movement as an example. She says, what they did is they broke traffic laws in order to make their cases about the injustice of Jim Crow. She says this would make no sense as a single person standing in the street. You need numbers, you need a group. And so here she's just laying out her basic idea in this introduction that civil disobedience is not the same as conscientious objection. And it's not the sense of a legal individual testing a law. It's a political act. And it's an act of an organized minority of people who she says are bound together by common opinion. And she wants to separate common opinion from common interest. We'll come back to that when we talk about John Calhoun, right? But in essence, what she's saying is we're not acting to break laws in civil disobedience because we want something, as a policy, right? It's not because we want um we want my immigration policy, or we want my policy about affirmative action. Um, she says those are interests. They're not opinions. Um, and what civil disobedience is a is a public organized minority of people bound together by opinions, right? Who stand against government policy, even when the government policy is backed by a majority. Even when we recognize that the majority of people elected these people who made these laws. And we are willing to stand against the laws and disobey the laws because we agree with each other and we support each other and we decide that our opinions, even though they may be minority opinions, are so important um, that that we are willing to um, make the case that the majority was wrong and try and, in a sense, convince them that we're right through the power of our convictions, as not as individuals, but as a collective, as an organized minority. It's it's a really original reading of civil disobedience. Um, really reading it as a kind of political act of a minority saying the majority has gone crazy, and we believe so firmly as a group, even though we're a minority, that the majority has gone crazy, that we're willing to break the law in the name of making the majority see their mistake. Um, it's not an act of conscience. It's an act of um, uh, political acting together. It's an act of political, communal, organized resistance. And so this brings us to part one of that's the introduction, as she expresses it. And in part one, she writes that against the political value of conscience, right? Um, Civil disobedience uh, is actually about political action, not about conscience, right? That conscience is not what is at stake, and here she has to clear the ground because the two most famous civil disobedience, Socrates and Thoreau, have been read by many people as conscientious actors. And so she has to somehow show that that's a mistake. Um, she does it in different ways. With Socrates, she wants to say that, well, actually, Socrates was not a conscientious actor, right? He doesn't oppose the laws. He's not saying the laws were wrong. What he's saying is that the jury verdict against me was wrong. And I don't have a beef with the laws. I have a beef with the jurors. It was a personal misfortune. And so what she says is Socrates isn't saying, I object to the laws. He's saying the jury was wrong, but I made a bet. And my bet was that I would convince the jury that they were that I was right, and I lost. The jury convicted me, and there's a kind of debt of honor as a gentleman that I have to accept my death, and that if I were to flee, as Crito and others want me to, um, I would be actually doing an injustice to the laws, which I respect. Um, we can talk about whether she reads Plato and Socrates correctly, but that's how she does it there. The second is Thoreau, and Thoreau she takes a different tack. She says Thoreau does associate civil disobedience with conscientious action. He does, unlike Socrates, oppose the laws themselves. He's opposing the laws of slavery and the laws supporting the war against Mexico, and that his opposition is based in conscience. So much so that what he says is, you know, I can't I can't be held responsibility for changing the policy of the government. That's not my job, and that's too much to ask of a citizen. All you can ask me is that I wash my hands of the matter, right? He says, as a citizen of a democracy, I have the right to not resign my conscience to the majority. And he says, so as a result, I can simply disobey the law. And if I do, I put my conscience against the laws, and I have to be willing to pay the punishment and go to jail. Um, uh, the reason I do it, for Thoreau says, is that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. Right? That's all that individual conscience requires, and no more. And so she says that this is a really another version of Aristotle's uh, idea of the difference between a good citizen and a good man. And the good man, right, the conscientious man, looks out for his conscience, not for the world. And thus the good man can be politically irresponsible. And she cites this Latin maxim that she uses in a number of her essays: fiat justitia et pereat mundus, right? Let justice be done even if the world will perish. She says this is Thoreau's maxim, right? I will do justice. I will clean my hands. I will act conscientiously. I don't really care about the world. Now, again, I'm not sure she gets Thoreau 100% right, although I think much of what she says is right. But the point is that a bit like Albert Camus as well, um, she thinks that Thoreau, in highlighting conscience, says, look, the reason you resist unjust laws is not for the sake of the world, but for your own sake, for the sake of your soul, for the sake of your health, for the sake of your welfare. Um, and so she says this idea of conscientious civil disobedience has problems in the political world. The first is it can't be generalized, right? I say it's my conscience, but if you say your conscience goes the other way, we're at a standstill. We have conscience stands against conscience. Um, and she says, Martin Luther King can say my conscience says this, and the whites in Birmingham can say my conscience says this, and it's conscience against conscience. So conscience can't really tell us anything about the world. And that's the first problem. The second is that conscience is concerned with myself. It's an interest in the care of my soul, or as Camus says, my own health and welfare. But she says, most people don't care about their soul. That's just not what they're interested in. Um, in her terminology, most people don't talk to themselves, think with themselves, live with themselves. And so if that's where civil disobedience comes from, most people, she thinks, will have nothing to do with civil disobedience. Um, and finally, of course, that with the loss of religion as a publicly central institution in modern societies, conscience has become secular. It's become simply an opinion, and as an opinion, um, uh, it stands against other opinions, but there's no way to prove it. The only way to, in a sense, assert that my conscience is right is to show that I'm willing to suffer for it. And I can burn myself alive in the public square. Um, I can um, I can say I'm willing to accept my punishment. But she says this is ridiculous because if you kill someone or rape someone and then you say, well, it's okay, and I'm willing to accept the punishment because I think I was right, she says we think you're nuts. Um, and so simply accepting your punishment doesn't make your conscience right. Um, and so here's the danger that she sees in the idea that civil disobedience is connected to conscience, which is that individual consciences are simply one opinion, and in the end, we need numbers. The strength of opinion doesn't depend on conscience, but on numbers. And this brings us to section 2 of the essay. Um, and here uh, she looks into this idea of civil disobedience more directly, right? Um, the point is that uh, for her, we have entered a world in which we have increasingly less respect for the law. She says, this is just around us. We see disobedience all around us. Crimes are not being punished, right? Um, I mean, we see this in our world too. She was citing statistics from the 1960s, right? But we can look around us, right? People are evading, subway fares in New York City, where I live. We've had for many years a widespread policy of looking the other way for businesses and other in other ways when people without legal entry and documentation have been living in the country. Um, and what she says is this creates a kind of um, aura of illegality or an aura of criminality. We normalize criminality. Um, and she says it shows us that when they're given a chance with lenient laws and lenient enforcement and social permissiveness, many people will act illegally and commit crimes. And if the criminal acts have no consequences, they'll continue to do so. And she goes into how in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s, this was happening. And what did government do in response? Well, it commissioned studies and did research. And she cites research from the Ford Foundation and others that come up with brilliant insights like the poorer you are, the more likely you are to suffer from serious malnutrition, right? Or that children in poor schools do not learn as well as children in rich schools, right? And she says these are brilliant, um, and you spend a lot of money on them, but nothing happens. Um, Her point is that what she wants us to understand is that if we want to understand civil disobedience, we don't need to like do great big studies and probe deeply into, questions of what is a criminal mind like or things like that. She goes, the civil disobedient is not a criminal. They're not a rebel, right? Um, what's obvious, and you don't need big studies to prove it, right, is that civil disobedience is a collective act of political dissent. It is a group phenomenon where lots of people decide to get together and express a widely shared minority opinion via extraordinary means to contest what they say is unjust acts by a ruling majority, right? And I mean, that definition, I think, if you look at what's going on in places like Minneapolis over the last month, makes absolute sense, right? You have a collective political dissent. It's a group phenomenon where you have hundreds and thousands of people blowing whistles and photographing and trying to intervene, right? Where you're willing to break laws to publicize a widely shared minority opinion via extraordinary means, right? Extraordinary in the sense of, yeah, we're breaking the law to contest unjust acts by a ruling majority. So for her, civil disobedience, uh, first one arises only with a significant number of citizens, right? You need numbers. It can't just be one or two or, I don't know, 10. It's got to be significant. Two, these this significant group, this numbers, have to be convinced that the normal channels of change no longer function and grievances will not be heard or acted upon. Right now, that's an interesting question, and we can come back to it in the question and answer period or the discussion period. But I mean, obviously, we could wait 2 or 3 years for an election. But I think what she would say in this case, and I think what people in Minneapolis and other places would say is it's that we have a procedure, right? We have procedures. You're supposed to be able to go to law enforcement. Well, local law enforcement was kicked out of the investigation, right? The state law enforcement was repressed. The normal channels in which we would offer a grievance are no longer functioning. Or she says there's another option, which is that the government is about to change in a way whose legality and constitutionally are open to grave doubt, right? This, I think she has in mind something a little different when you're about to elect a dictator and you're trying to prevent the dictator from taking over, or you think a dictator is about to take over and you're trying to prevent it. In any case, she lists a number of the things that she thinks are happening at the time, right? An undeclared war in Vietnam. I mean, obviously, we can make parallels to undeclared wars going on in Venezuela or potentially in Iran or Greenland, right? That secret agencies are acting without transparency and public accountability. Well, we certainly have that with ICE and DHS. That there's veiled threats to the First Amendment, she says. Well, we certainly are seeing that today. And that politicians like the vice president at the time are calling resistors vultures and parasites. Just like today we talk about how we're going to go after the homegrowns. So all of these ideas that she's talking about in the 60s, I think are present today, which is why I think this essay is so important today. She goes, okay, so if that's the case, what are the qualities of a civil disobedience? How does someone act civil disobedience? And this is, I think, essential for all of us who are interested in what's going on today, because civil disobedience can act as civil disobedience, but they can also overstep. They can do things that are mistakes and thus lose their authority as civil disobedience. So she says there are five, in a sense, qualities of a good civil disobedience. The first is that, unlike a lawbreaker or a common lawbreaker, the civil disobedient does not seek to hide from the law. They don't wear a mask. They don't hide from cameras. In fact, on the contrary, they announce their open defiance and they break the laws openly, right? And that's important. Two, the civil disobedient acts not for private interest or benefit. They act in the name of a group and of opinions of the group. She says that civil disobedience act together. They breathe together, she says. And they breathe the spirit of the laws. And as an example, she will offer the Freedom Riders, again, during the civil rights movement. The point is that they're acting together not because they want money or fame, but because they believe, right? They breathe together in the spirit of the laws. They believe that the laws are being violated by the laws. Namely, in this sense, the Constitution is being violated by the laws. The third is that the civil disobedient is not a criminal, but a political actor, someone whose action springs from agreement with others that lends credence and conviction to their opinion. And this is an important point because I still think most of us today, even those who support civil disobedience, believe that civil disobedience should be arrested because they're lawbreakers. And what she's saying is they're not. They're political actors. And they're breaking the law as an extraordinary emergency measure in an emergency time. And thus, because they're doing it openly and they're not trying to hide it and they're not trying to gain from it, and also importantly, the next one, they're not going to use violence, right? They should be seen not as criminals, but as political actors, and thus they should not be punished for their civil disobedience. Fourth, she says that civil disobedience must be nonviolent. When civil disobedience resort to violence, they disqualify themselves as civil disobedience and justify the label rebels. And this is, always one of the most important aspects of civil disobedience, and you see it today. Whereas one side tries to say the civil disobedience are rebels, are violence, are terrorists, are trying to like undo laws, and the other side says no, we are civil disobedience. We're trying to document and yes, break laws, but doing so not as rebels, but in the name of a higher law, not conscience, but the Constitution. And finally, she says that the civil disobedience does share with the revolutionary the wish to change the world, but they don't aim at revolution, right? They're not trying to undo the political system. In fact, they accept the very political system and the framework of authority which the revolutionary would reject. So these five ideas or qualities of the civil disobedience are essential to her understanding. And the overarching point that she wants to make is that, again, civil disobedience are not acting out of conscience. They are political actors. And we're dealing with organized minorities. Okay, but well, then they lost in the election, though, right? Why should they then break the law? And she makes this claim, and this is one of the most controversial moves in the essay because she cites John Calhoun, right? Um, John Calhoun obviously was a Southern pro-slavery politician, and later I think a vice president of the Confederacy, if I have that right. And um, uh, he makes this argument, what he calls concurrent majorities. He says that um, there are we live in a tradition, in a constitutional tradition, in which disobedient minorities, right, are not rebels and traitors, right? Arendt wants to say, and largely basing it on Calhoun's argument, um, that it's against the letter and spirit of the Constitution, she writes, to think of disobedient minorities as rebels and traitors. Our constitutional system was designed to prevent unbridled majority rule. That means that if there are large constituent majorities, I mean, large concurrent majorities where they're pretty close, right? Maybe 34% on one side or 30 or 40% on the other side. If 30 or 40% on one side wins and then tries to impose itself on the 30 and 40% on the other side, that, she says, is fundamentally against our constitutional tradition. And what civil disobedience does is it mobilizes organized minorities who are too important, she says, not only in numbers, but in quality of opinion to be safely disregarded. Well, how do you know they're too important in numbers and quality of opinion? Well, partly numbers, and partly the quality of opinion is showed by the numbers. And what she thinks is that in such a situation, to impose your absolute rule on the large numbers, the concurrent majority, is fundamentally at odds with a liberal, free, constitutional government. And she says that's the argument for civil disobedience as a political argument. She ends this section with a meditation on change and stability, right? That change is constant in human condition, but the velocity of change is not. And what she wants to say here is that um, the law is really an object of stability. And we think today laws are objects of change. We can pass a law and change things, right? We can pass a law and change affirmative action, or pass a law and change abortion, or pass a law and change immigration. And she says, actually, that's not the case, right? This is an old argument. Um, uh, and it's an argument that I think she's on the right side of, but it's complicated, right? When we changed the argument about Brown v. Board of Education about school desegregation, the law changed, but it took probably over a generation for the actual idea that segregated schools were bad to infuse itself throughout the country. The same with abortion. Roe v. Wade happened, and look what's happened. It's 70 years later, and the country is still divided on it. The 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War, and it wasn't really until the 1970s or 80s that it finally became enforced after the civil rights movement. The 18th Amendment outlawed liquor through prohibition, and it failed miserably. Her point in all this is that law doesn't change the way people think and doesn't really change society. But civil disobedience, in her mind, where is is a kind of social movement that can fundamentally change society. Because when a concurrent majority is willing to risk breaking the law, willing to say, we feel as not just an individual, but as a group of people, we feel so strongly that this is unconstitutional, that this is wrong, that we're willing to stop society, stop traffic, break laws in the name of that. She says those are the kind of movements that can actually change society. And she points to the 14th Amendment as the great example, which she says 100 years was in power, and it only really starts to become enforced with the civil rights movement, which she says for the first time brought fully into the open the enormity of the American crime, not just of slavery, but of chattel slavery, and led us to take responsibility for it. Okay, that's those are the first two sections of this essay. It's an incredibly rich essay, one that, as you maybe know, I just published a book where I included it with Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience. Um, Obviously, I think it's one of the most important and relevant essays today. The third part, right, which we will get to next week, is about her idea of why this idea of civil disobedience is so important in the United States, and she defends it as the right of dissent in any society of consent. But we'll get there next week and have times to develop it. In any case, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on it. It's one of my favorite essays of Hannah Arendt, so we will over this week and next week get to talk about it. If you can, of course, contribute to the chat. I see that's active as always. Please do be respectful. Look, these are very contemporary political issues, and I have no doubt that people on this Zoom call and the reading group have different opinions, which is totally fine. Be civil. Talk. You're welcome to argue with each other, but don't attack each other. And do it in a respectful way. You can also go down to the react button and press raise hand. One last note. I know we have a downloadable schedule of the schedule for the reading group online. We had to make one change this week, so we are not going to meet on February 27th. It's not a big deal. We just push things back. But if you have downloaded the schedule and want to check the new schedule out, I encourage you to go and do that again. All right. Bernie, you're up first.
Thank you, Roger. One of the things that, in her essay, she incorrectly asserts that Thoreau let her aunt pay the poll tax. And that's not true. His aunt did pay the poll tax, and a group of aunts probably arranged to kind of pay the poll tax into the future, just so Henry wouldn't get in trouble again. But he was very upset about it, that family had intervened to come in and basically neuter his act of protest by paying the tax. And so I think that there is a tendency to, whenever the issue of Thoreau's night in jail comes up, to kind of look for ways to trivialize it. And she seems to be participating in that here. The other thing, I still can't quite get around wrap my mind around her idea that conscience isn't political. I think that Thoreau is saying, I my only duty is to obey my conscience. And in effect, he's saying, and therefore, when conscience conflicts with the law, my duty is to conscience. And what could be more political than that? And he's else further on into the essay is saying the whole point of civil disobedience is that enough good people break the law in resistance to it, such that it becomes impossible for the greater society to imprison all these people of conscience. So it's not something that Thoreau is just saying, I'm just going to make my little statement for myself now. But I'm indifferent to how this impacts the world. Thoreau is definitely not one of those people. As someone who spent, about a decade defending civil disobedience protesters when they did tree sits, buried themselves in roads, all to protest Forest Service sales out here in the West, um, I have a lot of history with civil disobedience protesters. What they all have in common is they would agree that they should not be punished because what they're doing is right. Now, they always wanted to organize their opposition to punishment around something known as the necessity defense. And I don't see anywhere where Hannah Arendt dealt with that. But the idea, there is a recognized doctrine that you can avoid punishment for breaking a criminal law if you had no choice but to do so. There's a number of elements in that, and as a practical matter, it never really applied to anti-Forest Service protesters. So I was always dubious of the
Okay.
constant effort to try to apply the necessity defense. But
Thanks.
I would be interested in your comments on any of that.
Thanks, Bernie. I appreciate it. So, as for Thoreau, um, you know, who paid his poll tax, whether it was Emerson or his aunt or aunts, there's been lots written on it. It's been contested. In any case, your claim that Thoreau was upset about it, may or may not be true. He didn't stay in jail. He didn't protest t too much. Um, and you know, I think he enjoyed his night in jail, as he tells us. But regardless, I let's just leave that for a second. The bigger and more interesting 2 points you made. The first one is about conscience not being political. Um, uh, you know, again, the point that she's trying to make is that my conscience is my conscience. And if I say we should not have slavery and you say we should have slavery, they just stand in opposition to each other. Um, uh, that's what she means by conscience not being political. It's simply my it's a subjective view. She goes, what makes it political is that other people share it with me and it becomes a common opinion. Now, there can be multiple common opinions, but at some point, once we have common opinions, we're into the world of politics and we have to figure out how to find um, a shared view that we can have, and that's politics for her. So her problem with conscience is that outside of a Christian framework or a religious framework, if you're a Christian state or a Jewish state or a Muslim state or whatever state you're in, and then conscience actually has public viability. Outside of that, conscience is simply opinion, and she think I mean is but it's a single opinion, and therefore is not political as she understands it. Um, your point about the necessity defense, I think, fits with her quite well. She doesn't like the necessity defense because it treats it as a legal issue. Again, To say that we had no choice but to do this, she thinks that's ridiculous. Of course, you had a choice, and you chose to act collectively to oppose something you thought was wrong. And so she thinks that would just be like a kind of legal fiction. Um, she's trying to argue here that the legalized approach to civil disobedience is missing the boat. That if you actually look at civil disobedience, it is a collective action. Now, there are examples of conscientious objectors, right? And you could even hold Thoreau as one of them. By the way, it's somewhat important to remember that Thoreau's essay was not called Civil Disobedience, right? His original essay, if I have it, I have to go check but it was like on the responsibility of a citizen in civil government, and um, and you know, he was really looking at what does a moral, conscientious citizen do in response to an unjust government or unjust laws. He wasn't talking. He only later do we give it the name after he dies, civil disobedience, and it becomes sort of this idea, and she's sort of fighting against that idea. As for whether she read him rightly or wrongly, I think, as I said, I think she generally gets him right, but there are parts of his essay that I think are much more political and that she ignores. I don't think that's a problem because she's not trying to write an essay on Thoreau. She writes about him for one page. Um, and one of the places where he's more political is precisely where Bernie pointed out, where he says something like, you know, if 100 people resist an unjust law, nay, if 10 people, resist an unjust law, if one person resists an unjust law, and you put them in jail, if they're good people, it can change things. Whether he's right or not, I think is an interesting question. But that's a point where he does talk about changing the world. But most of the essay, he continues to say, I don't care about changing the world. That's not the main goal here. The main goal is to preserve the purity of my soul. And insofar as that's the main goal, um, that's what she's sort of trying to distinguish herself from and civil disobedience. But you're right, Bernie, that Thoreau is more complicated than any simple reading of him, and it's one of the reasons I put these two essays together. I think there's actually a lot they can learn from each other, and I think we should take both of them into account. So thank you. Uh, Burma?
Yes,
Hi, Burma. How are
uh,
you?
I'm fine, thank you. 2 points for trying to capture something of the originality of this essay. First is, um, it seems that for her, civil obedience is not an exception, is not a last resort, like, for instance, for John Rawls and so many other thinkers. It seems that for her, disobedience is a normal political democratic expression. So, can we say somehow that she normalizes, that she integrates civil disobedience into the common understanding of of uh, of citizenship and democratic politics? That's one. A second point, uh, trying to understand something of the grounding of her understanding of civil disobedience. I was struck by the fact that she needs no appeal to justice or equality or something of a higher ethical or normative order. So for her, it seems, other than Jürgen Habermas and so many others, for her it seems that she is detaching civil disobedience from individual or collective moral or ethical justifications, that it is purely political. And I am really surprised by these 2 points. The first one, somehow the normalization of civil disobedience in democratic, as an expression of democratic society. The second, detaching um, civil disobedience from a grounding in some normative higher order and approaching it as a purely political expression. Do I see this well, Roger?
Well, those are both excellent points and great questions. And um I would say you see it in a very clear way. Whether, there's clarity is in her text or not is unclear. So on your first point, um, you said it's not a last resort and it's sort of normalized. Yes and no, right? On the one hand, yes. Um, she's going to argue at the very end of the essay, we haven't gotten there yet, that civil disobedience should be seen as a fundamental constitutional right in the United States, one of the core constitutional rights, and that because it's not actually listed, there should be a constitutional amendment to guarantee the right to civil disobedience. Um, Secondly, as you said, she thinks that um, in the United States, you're going to often have situations of concurrent minorities and concurrent majorities. Um, and civil disobedience may be, something that happens periodically. On the other hand, right, she does call it extraordinary. She says it happens when not only it's not only that a group of people believe um, that their common opinion is being trampled by a majority, an elected majority, but they have to believe that the normal avenues of recourse do not exist, right? It can't just be we lost the election and they've made abortion legal or illegal and we don't like it and so we're going to start acts of civil disobedience. You actually have to believe that the legal system is not working, or the electoral system is not working, or there are ways in which the civil service or the people who are supposed to address these problems are not being responsive or not being able to be responsive. Um, and so I think that if you take that seriously, Burma, I don't think you can say that it's simply normal. I don't think she's normalizing it. Um, but I think you're right. She thinks that it's going to become and it has to be part of the American experience of freedom and free government because she expects that the American system of government will at times lead to the tyranny of the majority. There will be times in which the American form of government will lead to tyrannical majorities that oppose and impose their will on minorities in ways that are not only democratic but illegal. And and in those cases, civil disobedience is actually um, uh, uh, a constitutionally necessary response. Um, and so it's an extraordinary normalized idea, if I can put it in those terms. The second of your points, I think, is less problematic and more right on. I think you're absolutely right. She's arguing against people like Rawls and Habermas that civil disobedience is not an appeal to justice. It's not an appeal to conscience. This is also, I mean, and this is such a radical reading of civil disobedience, and Bernie was, I think having the same reaction you are, Burma, that this seems a little outside the box. Uh, and it is. She really does want to say it. And by the way, the in many ways the companion essay to this is the essay Truth and Politics in Between Past and Future, because it's in that essay where she makes it very clear that um, politics is about opinions, and and that it's not about justice, right? She says in that essay, "Fiat justitia periat mundus," is a crazy idea. To simply say I'm going to act for justice even if the world will perish, she says, is completely irresponsible and makes no sense. Um, we'd much rather have the world continue even if there's injustice done, and hope to do justice, over time. Um, and so, but that doesn't mean, right, that we should just never act in an extraordinary way. There may be times in which we have to. And she says the times when we have to are times when not only does a Democratic majority tyrannize a minority, but it then takes away the normal modes of redress and address. And then the response is not moral, but is political. It's it's based in the fundamental right to dissent in a government by consent, and that's what we'll talk about more um, uh, in a week when we read the third and last part of the essay. So you're absolutely right, Burma. She's arguing against Rawls and Habermas and other thinkers like that that think that civil disobedience is tied to justice or morality, and she's tying it to politics. The grounding for her political understanding comes in the next section, section three, where she talks about the right to dissent and how it relates to a society of consent. Okay.
Okay, and as well as against Mary McCarthy and George K-Tap and so many others.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I'd have to look at where you think McCarthy would disagree with her, because I think that
In
they are.
the letters,
Yeah.
in the book with the letters.
Okay, I'd have to look at that particular letter,
Yeah.
and if you have it, maybe send it to me and I'll talk about it next week.
Okay.
That would be great. John.
I'm trying to understand Calhoun's notion of concurrent majority. Um, it seems to me that there were two majorities, or the country was divided in half. There was a war fought over it, and laws were changed. And the side that lost resisted those changes for 100 years. And as far as I can tell, they are still resisting it, although it's not so much regional as it is throughout the country. That is, resisting the idea that all men are created equal, that war was based on. So it seems to me that Calhoun was making an argument for uh, with this concept of concurrent majorities, is making an argument for, in a situation of polarization, violence is the only solution. A violent solution or a civil war is the only way we can resolve this. And even with the Civil War, it wasn't fully resolved because we're still dealing with it now. Okay.
Well, thanks, John. Yeah, so just to, I mean, I think you might, I can't tell if you understood this or not, but Calhoun's argument about concurrent majorities is from before the war, not after the war, right? Um, and so his argument is that uh to um is that the country is divided and is polarized, right? And at a moment of polarization, for one side to impose its will on the other side after an election um, goes against the spirit of the Constitution, which is to um, allow for the different states and different parts of the country to live freely, differently, and that the federal government is not designed to impose one view or one moral view on dissenting parts of the country. Um, so his argument, if you understand it correctly from he's arguing for the slaveholding, is we slaveholders shouldn't impose our view on those who don't want to hold slaves, but until, as long as large concurrent majorities disagree, um, they shouldn't impose their view on us. That was his view. Arendt obviously um, doesn't support his view of slaveholding or anything like that. But what she's saying is he actually expresses, if and again, this is her. She likes to run close to the sun, as we say, right? Fly close to the sun, um, or too close to the hell. I don't know how you put it, but she's saying, look, I understand his arguments are, you know, not taken seriously because of the context in which he wrote them, but she thinks that there's something true about the general argument if you care about not about slavery or not slavery, but tyranny or not tyranny, right? That's the argument she's making. That I mean, I've just been teaching, Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, which for her is the real foundation of the American constitutional spirit. And what's just so vivid in the Montesquieu and in her reading of it is that um, the fundamental drive of the American Constitution, in her point of view, is to prevent tyranny, to prevent absolute concentrations of power. And what she's saying is the greatest threat to that constitutional system designed to prevent tyranny is any one side believing that in the name of justice they can impose their view of justice on everybody. That's a controversial view, right? It's saying that more important than justice is freedom and the prevention of tyranny. But that is central to her understanding of the American Constitution, and having lived through totalitarianism and the Holocaust and Bolshevism and Russia, that's her deeply held view that justice, that people who think that they can, in a sense, impose their view of justice on others is actually one of the greatest dangers to a constitutional order that's designed to prevent tyranny and freedom, right? There's the old Hegel line that I don't know if she ever cites it, but she certainly refers to it, that the greatest evil always conceals itself in the greatest good. Namely that it's the people who want to, that most people who do evil do it in the name of good. And that's what she's here, in a sense, pointing to. Uh, and I think I have no doubt that you know this is a view that challenges so many of us, because it goes to the heart of her skepticism about justice, right? And this goes back to Bernie's point at the very beginning, right? She really doesn't believe. I mean, she believes in justice, and she believes that justice is important, but she believes that justice is not political. Um, uh, and that especially in a world where everyone has different opinions and people have different views of justice, um, justice is just another opinion. And that in the name of justice, to say that we're going to impose our opinion on everyone else, even if it's like 51% to 49%, she says that's dangerous. And that's one of the things that I think makes Hannah Arendt so interesting and yet also unsettling for people today. And I think most people who don't find her unsettling just don't pay attention to that aspect of her work. Um, is that is that all right, John?
Yeah, it's okay. It's just that what happened in the Civil War and what happened after the Civil War. That's another
No,
discussion.
but
It
it's okay.
problematizes it.
It's a great point, right?
Yeah,
And what is she saying? Is she saying, well, the North shouldn't have um uh in, insisted on the end of slavery? Um, you know, she doesn't say one way or the other. She does think, right? She says very clearly slavery was the greatest crime. She says it was and here she says again that it was the greatest evil in America. But what she also says, right, is that slavery didn't really end with the Civil War or with the 14th Amendment. I
right.
mean, slavery ended, but racism didn't. And she's saying that the attempt to impose legally the end of abortion through Roe v. Wade or segregation through Brown v. Board Education, right, generally doesn't work. Right? She's making a much larger argument about the fact that law doesn't usually change the world. And the world won't change just because you pass a law. And so what she's saying is if you if you try and change the world through laws, right? And you do it in a kind of tyrannical way, you're going to create concurrent majorities that oppose each other. And civil disobedience is a political response to that. That's again, it's not a defense of slavery. It's in her mind, I think, a wide-eyed, realistic look at the impossibility and failure of simply imposing tyrannically moral change.
Yeah, I see that, but
Heather.
Hello. I feel I do understand. I hope I understand what Arendt is saying, but it seems the separation between conscience and political activism is too separated for her. In the UK at the moment, it's been a very successful day in the UK today because we have the government, the tyrannical government, as we saw it, those people who opposed it, passed a law which would say that to oppose genocide and to support civil disobedience in the form of breaking into Israeli arms factories in this country so that, in fact, our own country could break the law by helping Israel commit genocide. That what we did in resisting that was about conscience. It was about our conscientious objection to what the government was doing in our own name. So it's been a very moral rebellion, as it were, that we've participated in. And of course, if a single individual had just stood in the street and protested about what our government is doing, it would have been pointless because the government would have taken no notice. So clearly we had to act in solidarity and in that sense make ourselves a political movement. But the political movement was attached to conscience and it was attached to justice. And so people in the UK who are either Christian or not Christian or whatever religion, who are from the left or the right, are united in seeing that what protesters have done in the name of justice, whether they agree with it or not. So justice can't be separated from the political act. So this brings me back to Hannah Arendt. I've read her work again and again about this, and there is something about it. There's something about the way that she wants to make it a sort of clear-cut incision to separate conscience from political activity, which doesn't ring true to me, doesn't feel right to me.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, no. Um, I think your instinct is right that political movements often are attached to conscience and justice, right? I don't think she would disagree with that. But um, I think what she would probably say is that both sides can be attached to conscience and justice. Now, this is actually, I'll make one caveat to that, which is this is how she distinguishes Calhoun, right? If you look at the discussion of Calhoun, which is on page, oh I got so much right, 76, right? In the text, um, she says that John Calhoun's concurrent majorities, that is, sections of the population that are unanimous in their dissent. The term, unfortunately, is tainted by pro slavery and racist arguments. And in the disquisition on government where it covers only interests, not opinions and convictions of minorities that feel threatened by dominant majorities. Um, so what she says is that, and this would go back to John's question as well. She says that civil disobedience is not about common interests, it's about common opinions. And she's saying that Calhoun's idea of concurrent majorities dealt not with common opinions, but with only interests. I think what she means, right? She doesn't say any more about it, so I'm just trying to interpret it. Is that at this point in the 1850s, the slave states were no longer making um, they didn't state the opinion that slavery was right and constitutional and good. They had an interest in it, an economic interest, a political interest in it, and and that and they made the argument about of interest. And what Arendt is saying is civil disobedience can't come out of like interest because it brings it closer to self-interest and criminality. It makes it seem like it's about, getting ahead. Whereas for her, civil disobedience has to be about a common interest, a common opinion about what's good and what's right. And so I think you're absolutely right, Heather. It is connected to claims of conscience and justice, but if it's made um, only in terms of conscience and justice, the problem is that the other side can also make their claim in terms of conscience and justice, right? Both sides think that justice is on their side. Um, and and so she says, civil disobedience is really can't simply say it's because of justice, because if you say it's because of justice, then you think you have to impose it on other people without any limit, right? Even if the world will perish, fiat justitia et pereat mundus, and she doesn't think that's the case. Um, Partly, I think the background here is right. She no longer believes um, that there are absolute claims of justice in the world. Um, she thinks there are different opinions, and to take the slavery example, right? Uh, in order it is it is possible to change people's view and convince most people in the country, right, that slavery is wrong and should be prohibited throughout the whole country. But it takes time, and it's not going to be done, she thinks, by telling people who you disagree with, you're bad people, you're wrong, and we're going to, impose our way on you. Um, she makes that very clear in a number of her texts that simply telling people that they're wrong and telling people that you're going to impose your view on them doesn't generally work. And that's why she's saying um, it takes time to change the views of a society. Um, and laws are not generally a good vehicle to change people's minds. You change the laws after people have changed their views, not as a way to change people's minds. And I think that's her point. Um, And I think the opposing point, right, um, that people often make is laws are a moral signal, and it's important to change the laws, not because they'll actually, change people's minds right away, but because it signals to people our moral belief that this is right. And that's the argument of people who say, well, we should change the law even if it's not going to work right away. The problem with that, right, from an Arendtian perspective, is that if you change the law with the knowledge that it's not going to actually change people's opinions, but it's a signal, you then have to enforce the law, which means you're enforcing the law on people who don't agree with it. And if you're enforcing the law on large numbers of people who don't agree with it, well, she calls that tyranny. And it can be a tyranny in the name of justice, right? You can have a just tyranny. But she's, uh, let's just say she's incredibly skeptical of just tyrannies, um, given her history. James.
Roger, I was fascinated by the line came into this world not chiefly to make this a good place to live in, but to live in it, be it good or bad. Right? That's page 60. And as I went through all the material, it just kept spinning and resonating in so many ways. So I'm going to bring us right down into the pigsty and mention Andrew Paul Johnson, who was the insurrectionist pardoned by Trump, who went on to um, just be convicted for molesting children. And I'm wondering, in that chain of events, the pardon, his actions, Trump's, and the January 6th riots, is there any civil disobedience that we could ascribe to there?
Um, so so let's just start with the line, right? This is a line of Thoreau's that you're citing, right? Where
Yes.
he says that Thoreau said he came into this world not chiefly to make it this a good place to live in, but to live in it, be it good or bad. Um, and Arendt says, indeed, this is how we all come into the world. Lucky if the world and the part of it we arrive in is a good place to live in at the time of our arrival, or a place, at least a place where the wrongs committed are not of such a nature that it requires you to be an agent of injustice to another. Um, so she agrees with Thoreau, right? That some of us are born into places where we're lucky and we don't have to be agents of injustice, and some of us are born into places where we're unlucky and we have to be agents of injustice. And what she's saying is that Thoreau says, look, my job is not to make the world a better place. It's just to live morally. Um, Now Bernie says, well, Thoreau actually does want to change the world. And, I think Bernie's not wrong completely, but his argument, Thoreau's argument is very much about, look, I'm not here to change the world. I'm here to live in it well. Um, uh, and so to that extent, he does make an argument from conscience. As for um the January 6th thing, uprising, rebel, protest, insurrection, um, it's been called many things. Interestingly enough, it hasn't been widely thought of as civil disobedience, right? Could it be, right? Could it be an act of civil disobedience? Well, there's a couple problems with it. One is um, it wasn't so civil, right? Certainly wasn't nonviolent. Um, and she says that civil disobedience can't think of themselves as rebels. They have to accept the frame of authority. Again, it's not clear that they accepted the frame of authority. It says that they have to be open and not, and not seeking their own interests. I mean, that's a maybe I don't know. I have to look into each person. So I think it would be hard to paint what happened on January 6th as an act of civil disobedience.
What about the pardon?
What about what?
The pardon.
Well, the pardon is Trump's using his pardon power. It's just one person. So I don't think that's civil disobedience. I mean, it's not a now to the extent you think there's a movement um against the punishment of the January 6th people, uh you know, I guess you could say that it was a movement of civil disobedience insofar as it's not violent and it's accepting the authority and the framework of authority that the president has the right to pardon and saying that they thought that the majority, in this case, the elected Justice Department and people in the Biden administration, had done an unjust act, and that they're doing it openly and stuff. Yeah, I mean, I guess you could read the pardons um as the movement for the pardons. I mean, again, it's not a traditional I mean, the problem is they're not breaking laws insofar as the president has the legal authority to pardon people. So, I mean, it's not traditional civil disobedience, but you could certainly see it as a movement to um, oppose what they saw as an unjust uh, actions by an elected majority. But yeah, I mean, I guess if you wanted to, I mean, I guess um, I don't know what. Maybe I haven't really thought about it too much in this way, James. So I don't know if that's helpful.
It is. Thank you very much.
Yep. George. George, George, you got to unmute yourself.
I was saying I'm going to be brief. Back to Bernie's point, two questions. Number one, I think what Bernie was saying and what we saw in Minneapolis, although hopefully it's going to last, is the question is really how much skin do you have in the game? That's what was asked by a Polish mathematician who was talking about this. How much risk are you going to take? Because as he also said, we live in an attention economy, and how much are we going to risk to get attention? He says we're talking content means a way to get attention as opposed to the other way nowadays. So if you want to get attention, how much you're going to risk? And the people in Minneapolis were willing to risk things. They had skin in the game.
Yeah, well, I think that's the point. And that goes back to Burma's question too, because it requires, a certain kind of extraordinary act, right? Now, Arendt is trying to say that if it's done right, you shouldn't be arrested, but you can still be killed, as we saw. 3 people were shot, 2 were killed, um, and many others were arrested and detained. So yeah, I think it does take a risk, and I think that's an important point, and that's one of the reasons that it makes it powerful. Gilbert, you have a quick point?
Yes,
Well,
thank you. Thank you. First of all, please receive my greetings.
they're received. Thank you, Gilbert.
You're most welcome. So, I have 2 questions based on
Quickly, Gilbert. Try and ask
Okay.
one question.
So the first question is based on this context, majority versus minority legitimacy. Now, what prevents any group from claiming legitimacy under her model? That's the first question. The last question is based on this context, saying that civil disobedience as a sign of democratic vitality. So, could widespread civil disobedience also signal democratic breakdown?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, good question. So, I mean, the idea of the democratic breakdown, right, is what she's actually talking about the breakdown of authority, right? The loss of authority. And what she's saying is um people read, look, you see it today, right? The people in power in Washington are saying these civil disobedience are just part of the, are terrorists or people who are undoing the law, and they're reading it as part of a breakdown of authority. Um, and she's trying to say no. In fact, if it's done rightly, civil disobedience is actually a recognition of authority. And that's sort of the claim she's making. I think the first question you ask is a really good one. What prevents someone from claiming legitimacy, right? And that's the question that goes to the Calhoun question. Why is it that it's legitimate for civil disobedience on the side of um, um, migrants and the rule of law in Minneapolis, but not for the South in the Civil War? And her answer, again, if I understand it correctly, and I'm not sure it's a satisfying answer, so I'm just giving you what I take to be her answer, is that in the South they were fighting for interests, not opinion. Um, and and again, I don't know if that holds up, but I think that's at least the answer that I take from this. Uh, we'll take one more question, Rachel.
Thank you. I'm going to just read you the question so we can get through it. I'm thinking about this in relation to totalitarianism. So, is it implied that civil disobedience, by definition, does not take place in a totalitarian state, such as in Germany? So, like if citizens under the Reich defied the law by hiding Jews, for example, were they acting as a matter of conscience? Or were they civil disobedience? And can you say, for example, that what the Danes did collectively in the resistance to the Germans was an act of, was that civil disobedience?
Okay, great questions. So in the question around people who hid Jews, no, I don't think that's civil disobedience as Arendt understands it, because it's not open in public, right?
Ah,
You have to, it's an act of conscious objection. But it's criminal because you're trying to get away with it. And you don't accept the authority of the totalitarian regime. Whereas Arendt says that a civil disobedient does accept the authority of the regime they're in, and they want to restore it and protect it. The Danes example, I think, is a better example, although I have to, and I know some about it. I teach a little of it, but I'm not an expert in it. But insofar as the Danes in public, like the king, stitched a yellow star onto their shirt and walked around openly, right? I think
mm,
it's closer to an act of civil disobedience. Um, and uh, although um, where I don't know enough, Rachel, is that I don't know to what extent. I don't really know the Danish government right then, and to what extent it was the German government or the Danish government. I mean, who they were appealing to. I mean, was there an attempt to change the law, or was it just a moral, publicly brave action? And I don't know the answer to that, so I would have to learn more about it to fully analyze it. But it's closer than the other one because it's in public. And so yeah, I mean, I think your overarching point is right that in a totalitarian government or even in a tyrannical government, civil disobedience is less possible because you're not appealing.
right.
There's no authority that you're appealing to beyond the governmental authority. And in what she thinks makes America uniquely open to civil disobedience is that there are all these different authorities, the federal, the states, but also the different constitutions. And so you can actually make the argument that you're breaking the law in the name of authority and of the law, not against the law. And that's the core of her understanding of civil disobedience.
Thank you. It's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. We're over time. I know, Bertie, you wanted to ask another question, and I see Anne Marie has had her hand up for a while. Anne Marie, do you just want to say your question and we'll come back to it next week? Or do you want to wait till next week?
I guess I want to emphasize the completely dissatisfying notion of opinion. I wonder if Arendt has, thinking of Adorno's opinion to lead to society, but the notion of secularization underlying this essay and its relation to opinion, I'd also like to think about. I'm not going to say any more than this.
Great.
There's so many.
Well, that's actually a great comment to end with, because next week we're reading part 3, which is all about opinion. It's about consent and dissent. So why don't we table that for now and come back to it in our discussion next week. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Have a great week. I'll see you next week for the conclusion of a reading of Civil Disobedience. Thanks very much.